Hey, 1, 2. Welcome to tonight's council meeting, the 22nd of February 2021. Can you all please be upstanding for the reading of the council prayer? I call upon Councillor Watson to read the council prayer.
Thank you. Almighty God, we humbly seek your blessings upon this council. Direct and prosper its deliberations to the advancement of your glory and the true welfare of the people of the city of Boroondara. Amen.
Thank you. Please be seated. I'd also like to call upon Councillor Biggar to read the acknowledgement of country.
I acknowledge the traditional owners as the original custodians of this land, including the Wurundjeri people in the northern part of our city, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and those emerging, and elders from other communities who may be here today.
Thank you, Councillor Biggar. Given the recent changes to COVID restriction, councillors are able to be present this evening for this meeting. This meeting is being live streamed on Council's website to enable the community to view the proceedings. Should any technical problems be encountered this evening, the meeting will be adjourned until the problem is rectified, or if needed, the meeting will be postponed. I'd now like to introduce my fellow councillors and officers. Seated to my left and closest to me, Councillor Jim Park, Councillor Susan Biggar, Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Nick Stavrou, Councillor Felicity Sinfield, Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, Councillor Wes Galt, Councillor Di Gillies, Councillor Jane Addis, and on my right, Councillor Victor Franco. We have a number of other officers in attendance this evening. Seated to my direct right, Mr Philip Storer, the Chief Executive Officer. Seated behind Councillor Galt, Mr Bruce Dobson, Director of Customer and Transformation. Seated behind Councillor Stavrou, Ms Carolyn McLean, Director of Community Support. Seated behind Councillor Gillies, Mr Sharan Wickramasinghe, Director of Urban Living. Seated to my left, Mr David Thompson, Manager of Governance and Legal, and to his left, Ms Helen Pavlidis, Senior Governance Officer. There'll also be a number of other staff members in attendance this evening to assist us on the reports as they come through. Mr Thompson, are there any apologies this evening?
Sorry. Through you, Mr Mayor, there are no apologies this evening.
Thank you. We'll turn our minds to item 1 on the agenda, the adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the special council meeting held on the 7th of December 2020 and the council meeting held on the 14th of December 2020. Councillors, I'm in a search of a motion to adopt the minutes. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Chair, Mr Mayor. Circulated.
Thank you. And Councillor Addis, a seconder. Is there any opposition to that? I declare those minutes carried. Thank you, councillors. Item 2, declaration of any conflict of interest of any council or council officer. Are there any conflicts of interest this evening? There appears to be no conflicts. Thank you, councillors. Item 3.1, petitions. This will be introduced by Mr David Thompson.
Thank you, and through you, Mr Mayor. Councillors, since you last met, we've received 3 petitions. The petitions are set out in the agenda paper behind me on the screen. Accordingly, I commend the officer's recommendation to you this evening.
Thank you, Mr Thompson. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Biggar.
Yep, I'm happy to move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. And do I have a seconder to this? Fastest fingers first is Councillor Addis. Thank you, Councillor Addis. And Councillor Biggar, do you seek to speak to the motion?
Thank you, Mayor. I want to move the officer's recommendation to note and receive the petitions tonight. And I want to, I suppose, particularly thank members of the community for engaging with us and for bringing to our attention matters that are of real importance to them and across the municipality. And in particular, can I acknowledge receiving of the petition to fly the Aboriginal flag at more of Council's facilities. I'm I welcome the opportunity to have these discussions with my colleagues over the coming months and look forward to the deputation tonight from Reverend Lawfrey and Mr. Beggs. So thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, is there any discussion on this item before I put it to the vote? All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We do, as mentioned by Councillor Biggar, we do have a deputation this evening. Deputations will be done by Mr. Reverend Glenn Lowry and Mr. Jim Beggs, AM. So welcome to the council meeting. You've joined us as representatives of the Burundara Reconciliation Network. I acknowledge council has received your petition, which we've just tabled and noted earlier this evening. The purpose of your deputation, as I understand it, is to provide a context to the petition and to speak in support of the petition. As previously advised, you have a maximum of 6 minutes combined for your deputation to council. At the 5.5 minute mark, we have a new bell. I'll ring that bell when we get to that 30 seconds remaining, just to wind things up. At the conclusion of your deputation, please note that councillors may actually ask some questions on your deputation. So if we can call forward our first speaker. Reverend Lowry, thank you.
Daralinya Badu Wiradjuri Yawan Nadi Glenn Lockery. I'm proud to be Wiradjuri man, and my name is Glenn Lockery. I acknowledge the continuing custodians of the land on which we meet, the peoples of the Kulin Nation, and elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge Mayor Gary Thompson, Deputy Mayor Cynthia Watson, all councillors, and thank you for this opportunity. The petition before us is that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags be flown alongside the Australian flag on council property. Flags are language and have been used as such down through the ages, becoming what we know as the semaphore system of communication. Language speaks, and the language we use is important. Thus, flags are important. This is an important petition for the tradition of flying flags over property that has been long used to indicate who is in residence in this place at this time. The flying of the national flag reminds us of where we are and who we are responsible to and who is responsible for us. It reminds us whose country we are on. In terms of our petition, here are some reasons why you might decide to fly all three flags together. Doing so recognises our history as a nation, both ancient and modern, and brings all that together in an official object lesson for anyone who sees the flags together. Doing so recognises that the sovereignty of this nation and the custodianship of this space is shared with no one particular worldview triumphing over the other. Doing so affirms we recognise what was here for 65,000 years, a sophisticated and nuanced set of cultures which cared for country as kin and found ways to live in harmony with each other, our kin and ourselves. Doing so indicates that we all share in the changes in culture and life, both the positive and the negative, that came with those who came later, and wish to live in harmony with each other to ensure a positive future for all. Doing so indicates an intention to both recognise and reconcile a relationship that was broken before it began. It is a simple act, free of much controversy, as it is a practice that is in place in other levels of government, academia and business, and is a well-accepted way of inclusion and belonging. Doing so indicates to our people a certain sense of safety, that in this place we are seen and our voice is heard, that here there is the possibility of belonging and inclusion. I recommend this petition to Council and look forward to seeing the flags of this country flying together above Council property in Boroondara. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll call upon our second presenter, Mr. Biggs.
I too would like to pay respects to elders past and present, owners of this territory we now meet on. My name is Jim Beggs. My wife Tui and I have lived in Boroondara in the same house we built for the past 70 years. There were no roads, no sewage, no trees, few neighbours, and as a young couple we were doing it tough. We now enjoy living in one of Melbourne's most magnificent tree-lined suburbs in our country. Over those years, we have had the privilege of knowing some of Australia's most outstanding Aboriginals living here in Bundoora, Boroondara, sorry. And just to mention a few of those, Harold Blair, the great opera singer, we may remember. Auntie Marge Tucker, presented with the MBE by the Queen for her work. The Jacamos family, very active in the early part of establishing voting rights for Aboriginals. Bill Onus and his son Lynn, and I believe Lynn has a painting in your offices somewhere here. Stuart Murray had that shop up in the hills and really introduced Australian white people to the culture of our Aboriginal people. And the Tregoning family. And there's an oral history of many more of these people living in the Bundoora area. Melbourne was settled in 1835, and in 1840 the land here in Bundoora was subdivided and sold off. History records the purchase of the Crown land was paid to the government, but it also states in that comment, but not to the then owners, the First Nation people. Some of you, and I think all of you, would remember the 2000 Olympic Games, when a young Australian girl brought every Australian to their feet with pride and joy, when she won gold for her country, Cathy Freeman. At the end of the race, she wrapped the Australian and Aboriginal flags around her, flags that she loved and supported. Then she did a lap of honour, and it was a sign from her that where we started as a nation and where we are now. Many councils today have taken up the honour of recognising our past and our present by flying flags permanently from their offices. May I respectfully suggest, Mr Mayor and councillors, our council would not only be doing the right thing, but the just thing, for us to recognise 60,000 years of nurturing of Bundoora, as compared to only the last 250 years. By flying the Aboriginal flag, would recognise their efforts. Thank you.
Thank you for your deputations. Councillors, are there any questions on... Sorry, are there any questions on the deputations? Councillor Franco.
I have a question for Reverend Glenn Loughrey. Can you hear me? In relation, you've spoken eloquently in relation to the significance of the Torres Strait Islanders flag, and I'm curious what you think Boroondara Council should do in respect of the Torres Strait Islander flag.
Councillor Franco, apologies for interrupting. It's questions of clarifications on the deputation rather than questions of the deputation. Just getting some governance advice.
Okay. Could this...
Questions of clarification.
This is a question, Mayor, in relation to clarifying an aspect of the presentation, the deputation.
So questions of matters for which purposes of clarification, but no discussion. So questions of clarification. So you've got a question of clarification?
I do.
Allow that. Thank you.
If you could clarify, you raised in your presentation the significance of the Torres Strait Islanders flag, but I'd like to understand what specifically you think Boroondara Council should be doing, and what I'd like you to address and clarify in relation to that is the petition we've received addresses purely the Aboriginal flag, and whether you consider that is something that we should also be addressing. I wasn't clear. If you could expand on that or clarify, I'd appreciate it.
The issue is with Australia that there are 3 such flags: the Australian flag, the Aboriginal flag and the Torres Strait Islander flag. Often when they are flown together on the basis that there are 3 different groups of people who live in Australia. There's the Aboriginal people, there's the Torres Strait people, and there's the people who came later. Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Island people are 2 very distinct cultures, practices, and have 2 very different experiences of colonialism and of the coming of the people from England. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to consider the process of flying all 3 flags if it's possible, because it really includes each and every group of Australians in doing so. And it's important because for Aboriginal people, we carry country in our body. Even when we're not in our own country, we're on country, if you know what I mean. So we bring it with us. It's like our DNA. So when we're here, for a Torres Strait Islander person to walk down the street and see their flag flying, it says, this is a safe place. I am, in a sense, home, and I belong here as well as from my own place. It's really... So I would be suggesting that those 2, I wasn't involved in writing the original petition, but that's just my position, and I hope that clarifies the question.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Any other? Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Mr Lockery, thank you for your presentation. Sorry if I turned around.
Yeah, you're right. It's okay.
Sorry, it's just an awkward position to be sitting. Your presentation was excellent and the words resonated very well. Are you agreeable to share the words that you read out?
I'm very happy for a copy
Mayor
of that
Council?
to be given to the council officers and circulated amongst you. That is fine. It's a little bit folded now, but it's here. I can send an email copy.
Thank you. That'd be fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
There appears to be no further lights on. So to both Reverend Lockery and Mr Beggs, thank you for your deputation this evening. And you may retire at your leisure from the council meeting. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. The next item of business is informal meetings of councillors. Item 4. There is a motion on the screen. Councillors, is anyone prepared to move a motion to receive and record the informal meeting of councillors as printed on the screen? Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, as circulated.
Thank you. And Councillor Biggar.
I'm happy to second.
Thank you, Councillor Biggar. Is there any discussion on that item before I put that to the vote? All those in favour? Declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. There's been a request from our deputation presenters just to make one final comment. At the discretion of the chair, I'll allow that to occur because we've moved on in the agenda. So please come forward, Mr. Biggs. If you can keep it brief, please.
Mr. Mayor, I'd just like to say this. I'm 91, and I would have hoped before I die, I will see this nation recognised by the rest of the world as a fair place to live. We're the only Commonwealth country that doesn't recognise our own people, our First Nation people. And I think the rest of the world must not look at us in a kind way for that. And I just feel that at this time, this proposition we've put tonight, just raising the flag, is only a small step, because eventually the younger generation will want Australia to be seen by the rest of the world as a country that is fair income and free. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. We'll move on to item 5, public question time. Council encourages the submission of public questions prior to 12 p.m. on the day of the meeting. Questions submitted prior to 12 noon will be provided with a detailed verbal response as well as a response in writing. Those submitted after 12 will receive a verbal response if possible, but will otherwise be taken on notice for a written response to be provided in due course. Mr. Thompson, do we have any public questions?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Councillors, 5 questions have been received. 3 questions were received prior to 12 noon today, and 2 questions were received after 12 noon. Copies of the questions have been circulated to you. The questions have also been referred to the relevant council officer to provide a written response to the submitters in due course.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. The first question was received by Mr. John Grover. The question has been received. The question is not allowed as it does not relate to an item listed on the council agenda for this evening, and the question has not received a written response from a member of council staff or a councillor in accordance with Chapter 2 of the Governance Rules. The submitter of this question will receive a written response from council in due course to their question. Our second question has been received by Mr. Hundley. Its subject is the biennial report on the report on the activities of the Audit and Risk Committee COVID-19 budget impact. The question is, please advise of the incurred and prospective impacts of COVID-19 on revenue and expenditure in the council budget as assessed by the Audit and Risk Committee. The question relates to a matter on the agenda for the current council meeting and therefore is allowed in accordance with Chapter 2 of the Governance Rules. I call upon our Acting Chief Financial Officer, Ms. Callista Clark, to respond to the question from Mr. Hundley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for your question, Mr. Huntley. Council's 2021 adopted budget included $8.35 million reduction in revenue streams, and this was primarily in user fees and statutory fees and charges. Unexpected cost increases also impacted the 2021 budget, mainly due to the temporary closure of Council's leisure and aquatic facilities. This was primarily offset by a reduction in employee costs and a deferral of some expenditure. Since the adopted budget, Council's September amended budget, endorsed by Council in September 2020, identified a further net $6.4 million loss in revenue and expenditure impacts as a result of COVID. A full-year forecast review in 2021 is currently underway, and early estimates project a further $7 million in loss in revenue streams. Officers continue to monitor revenue and expenditure impacts from Council and we'll report these when the forecast review is finalised. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Ms Clark, for your response. Mr Hundley, you will receive Mr Councillor Park.
Mayor, I just wondered, for the sake of clarification, if I heard the question correctly, it finished with as something along the lines of as assessed by the Audit and Risk Committee. Obviously, whilst it wasn't said, it would seem to me that the answer was given in terms of the assessment made by the administration, not by that committee. If that's so, perhaps if that could just be made clear, because the committee, in my view, doesn't form such opinions.
Thank you for the clarification, Councillor Park. And Ms Clark, are you able to respond to clarify that?
Yes, you're right, Councillor Park. Whilst the Audit and Risk Committee noted here, it is identified by officers, and this is also included as part of the September and December QPR quarterly reporting, which identifies forecast impacts, as well as part of the March QPR, which will be presented to Council identifying further COVID impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Clark. And Mr Hundley, you'll receive a written response to your question in due course. The third question submitted tonight is again from Mr Hundley. The subject is December 2020 Quarterly Performance Report, specifically heritage protection of properties in Balwyn, Balwyn North, Deepdene and Greythorn. The question is, please advise what, if any, action is now proposed by Council to systematically provide heritage protection for post-1945 properties in Balwyn, Balwyn North, Deepdene and Greythorn in the wake of the abandonment of such actions, such as the consequences of a decision made by the Urban Planning Special Committee on the 7th of September 2015. The question relates to a matter on the agenda for the current council meeting and therefore is allowed in accordance with Chapter 2 of the Governance Rules. I call upon the Director of Urban Living, Mr Shran Wickramasinghe, to respond to this question from Mr Hundley.
Thank you, Chair. In accordance with the Urban Planning Special Committee's resolution of 18th August 2020, councillors commenced the Balwyn Heritage Peer Review Stage 3 to progress the implementation of heritage controls to 18 individually significant post-war properties identified in the Balwyn Heritage Study 2015. Once the review of the 18 properties has been completed, draft heritage citations will be prepared for these properties, and once that is completed and presented to Council, a community consultation process will commence. Community consultation is expected to occur in mid-21. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Wickramasinghe. Mr Hundley, you'll receive a written response to your question in due course. The fourth question received tonight is from Ms Joy Mettam. The question relates to a matter on the agenda for the current council meeting and therefore is allowed in accordance with Chapter 2 of the Governance Rules. The question was received without notice after 12 noon today and will be taken on notice for a written response in due course. Ms Mettam, you will receive a written response to your question in due course. The question pertains to December 2020, the Quarterly Performance Report, damage caused by high winds. The question specifically is, the Quarterly Performance Report identifies the cost of damage caused by high winds in November 2020 at $44,427. How is this sort of events factored into Council's climate change risk assessment? The fifth question this evening was also received from Ms Joy Mettam. The subject is the biannual report on the activities of the Audit and Risk Committee. Audit and Risk Committee recommendations. The question specifically is, what recommendations does the Audit and Risk Committee make to manage the potential risk associated with climate change to the budget and resources of the City of Boroondara? The question relates to a matter on the agenda of the current council meeting and therefore is allowed in accordance with Chapter 2 of the Governance Rules. The question was received without notice after 12 noon today and will be taken on notice for a written response in due course. Ms Metham, you'll receive a response to your question in due course. Item 6 on our agenda this evening. Mr Thompson, do we have any notices of motion?
Through you, Mr Mayor, there are no notices of motion for consideration this evening.
Item 7.1 is the Council of Code of Conduct. This will be introduced by Mr David Thompson, Manager of Governance and Legal.
Thank you, and through you, Mr Mayor. Councillors, the Local Government Act 2020 requires Council to develop a Councillor Code of Conduct, the Code, on or before the 24th of February 2021. The matters which the Code must include are 4 new mandatory standards of councillor conduct, otherwise known as the Conduct Standards, and a new internal arbitration process for determining complaints alleging misconduct under the Code. The Conduct Standards outline mandatory requirements for councillors that address the following main areas of council behaviour. Standard 1, treatment of others. Standard 2, performing the role of councillor. Standard 3, compliance with good governance measures. Standard 4, council must not discredit or mislead council or the public. The conduct standards are intended to provide greater clarity around the behaviour expected of councillors and a consistent framework for handling complaints alleging misconduct under the Code. The Code is not, I repeat, the Code is not intended to be an outward public community-facing document, but rather a statement of the expectations of councillor conduct as agreed to by councillors. The Code is about how councillors will work together as a group. The Code fulfils the legislative requirements of the Local Government Act 2020, and the other key issues associated with the Code are set out on pages 11 and 12 of your business papers. It would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the typo on page 16 under the heading of Good Governance. This typo has been corrected and I apologise for this error. Accordingly, I can now commend the officer's recommendation as set out on the screen behind me to you this evening.
Thank you, Mr Thompson. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr Thompson? Councillor Franco.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Thompson. Specifically in respect of the Section 2.5 role of the CEO, the final 2 paragraphs of that on page 38 of the council report, is it not the case that I'll read out the words, the CEO will determine the extent to which councillors will be informed of any decisions made in pursuit of these functions. Councillors acknowledge any information provided by the CEO is provided as a courtesy and in pursuit of maintaining good working relationships. And the further paragraph, councillors accept that they must not seek to direct the CEO with respect to the fulfilment of these functions. Is it not the case that sections of the Act, in fact, potentially are inconsistent with these words? And secondly, is there any problem in deleting these paragraphs?
Thank you, Councillor Franco, for the question, and through you, Mr Mayor. The CEO's obligations under Section 46 of the Local Government Act 2020 will take precedence over the statements contained in the Code. So the CEO can't avoid compliance with his obligations under Section 46.4 and 46.6 of the Local Government Act 2020 by way of example, to inform councillors of or to provide councillors access to specific things by pointing to the discretion that is noted in Part 2.5 of the Code. The obligations of the CEO under the Local Government Act 2020 will prevail over the Code. In that way, the Code is inconsistent with the obligations as set out in the Local Government Act 2020. It is just that the discretion noted in the Code must be read as being subject to any statutory obligations on the Chief Executive Officer. Acknowledging that the Code of Conduct is the councillor's code, if it's councillor's preference that particular section from the proposed councillor code of conduct can be removed. That's ultimately a decision for councillors to make, councillor.
Thank you.
Councillor Franco, any further questions?
No further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from councillors? There appears to be none. I'm in search of a motion, councillors. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm happy to move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. And to assist Councillor Watson, have a seconder, Councillor Addis. Thank you. To assist Councillor Watson, is there any opposition to the motion?
I would foreshadow that I wish to move an amendment to delete those paragraphs from the Code of Conduct.
So, Councillor Watson, do you seek to include those comments?
No, I don't. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Franco, then we are moving your amendment. We probably need to obtain a short adjournment, councillors, to get the appropriate wording. It's the deletion of that clause. Have we got specific to that clause?
The amendment would be to delete the two paragraphs under section 2.5, role of the CEO, and I could read out the words. The CEO will determine the extent to which councillors will be informed of any decisions made in pursuit of these functions. Councillors acknowledge any information provided by the CEO is provided as a courtesy and in pursuit of maintaining good working relationships. And the follow-up paragraph continuing, councillors accept that they must not seek to direct the CEO with respect to the fulfilment of these functions. That's the motion.
Just wondering if we can get that on a screen for other councillors and our gallery to see. Councillors, to assist Councillor Franco, is there a seconder to Councillor Franco's amendment? We have a seconder, Councillor Biggar.
Yes, I'm happy to second.
Through you, Mr Mayor, and to assist councillors, it's just going to take a little while to type it up. What officers understand is that Councillor Franco's amendment is to adopt the officer's recommendation as printed, subject to under item 2.5 of the code, those words that are up on the screen that my pen mark has gone through, having those particular items excluded from the code.
And Councillor Franco, to confirm that's your amendment?
That's correct.
Thank you. And Councillor Biggar, thank you. Councillors, to assist Councillor Franco, is there any opposition on this item? I'll foreshadow there is opposition. Councillor Franco, as the mover, do you wish to speak to your item?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think it's very important in relation to adopting the Code of Conduct for councillors that the code not in any way mislead or misguide the readers of the code, and in the form that it's currently presented, it is, as we've been informed by the Manager of Governments, misleading. It requires to understand these paragraphs suggest that information will be provided as a courtesy by the CEO in pursuit of maintaining good working relationships. However, it is clear that the Local Government Act does provide obligations on the CEO to provide certain information to councillors. Specifically, it requires the CEO to inform council before implementing organisation restructure will affect the capacity of council to deliver the council plan, and require a CEO to ensure council has access to the workforce plan. And it's incumbent on councillors to be across the detail to the extent that we are responsible and accountable for approving the operational budget, which is a significant component of our budget. Now, read in isolation the way it's presented here requires a councillor to understand the backdrop of legislation that does provide obligations on the CEO, and I understand that this code doesn't override it, but it provides an arguably misleading information to councillors who are not conversant in detail with the Local Government Act. And I think on balance, and given that it's clear that it's somewhat inconsistent, we're better off striking these paragraphs out. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Councillor Biggar is a seconder. Do you wish to speak now or reserve your right? Any other councillors wishing to speak on this item? Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to thank Mr Thompson for the explanation he gave for the inclusion of this particular paragraph, and I can certainly understand at a simple reading of it that it may in fact cause a little bit of concern. But I think it actually reflects the reality of the CEO's function, that he has to determine the extent of the information that a councillor is requesting, and always keeping in mind that very fine balance between the role that we play and a councillor crossing the barrier, crossing that boundary and getting involved in operational matters, which is not looked on with a great deal of favour in the Local Government Act. So I think that if you were seeking some clarity in this code of conduct, you could go down the path and suggest that there's some clarification put in there to say that legislative requirements always prevail. But I think that the paragraph in there does very much describe the relationship between the CEO and the councillors. And in my experience here in Boroondara, the relationship has been courteous and harmonious, and speaking from at a personal level, I've always found the administration incredibly helpful when I've had a question and sought clarification and extra information. So I am opposed to this particular amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Addis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Look, rather than repeating everything that Councillor Watson said, I'll just add a couple of other things, and I certainly endorse what was said. To me, this reflects a gesture of goodwill, that there are certain things that may not be strictly required strictly required by the Local Government Act, but I think experience tells us that there are grey areas, and to me this respects that goodwill of very often we are informed of all sorts of things that affect our ability to do our job, and that's how I read it, that of course the requirements would be met. This is something a bit more about respect and trust. So I was very comfortable with how it was. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. Councillor Park.
I'm going to support this amendment, not because I think anything much turns on it, but more so that I see no harm in taking that approach. It takes out half a dozen lines from an already overly long document, and substituting, as Councillor Watson said, words like legislation will prevail, well, you don't need to say it, that's fact. So my position is simply that the amendment does no harm, and on that basis I've no problem supporting it.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I thank Councillor Franco for bringing this to our attention. I've reviewed this document numerous times before and I've never had a concern with it, and I concur with Councillor Watson and Councillor Addis that we've always had access to information that's deemed appropriate, we have access to. But looking at this as a public document, I can understand the point that Councillor Franco raised, that it could be a little bit ambiguous, it could be misconstrued, and when you look at it, councillors acknowledge any information provided by the CEO as a courtesy. It perhaps does give the wrong impression that we are limited of what access to documents we need to do due diligence. So I concur with Councillor Park's comments that I see no harm in removing it to avoid any confusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Any other councillors wishing to speak on this item before I return to the mover? Councillor Franco.
Thank you. I'll simply say that I think the tone of these particular words that I'm suggesting be struck out is incorrect, because it suggests, or they suggest, that it's at the courtesy and will, and we have to ingratiate to the will of the CEO. Not that the CEO or the staff are in any way not forthcoming. Since I've been here, they've certainly complied with every obligation that I have seen. So that's not the issue. The issue is that they have a legislative requirement in respect of certain matters, and these words suggest that it's purely all the information is a matter of courtesy and maintaining good working relationships where there are legislative obligations. And I think it's really important that councillors remain clear in relation to what the obligations of the CEO are in respect of the elected council and in respect of our own obligations. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. There is no other speakers, so I'm not going to put this amendment to the vote. All those in favour of the amendment? And those against? I declare the amendment carried. So the amendment is now the substantive motion. So the amendment again on the screen reflects the movers, Councillor Franco, and the seconder, Councillor Biggar. I'll put the substantive motion to the vote. All those in favour? Those against? I declare that carried, councillors. So we'll need to reflect that in due course in the motion. Yep.
Just to assist councillors in the meeting, in order for the Councillor Code of Conduct to be adopted, it needs to be adopted by 2/3 of the council. So therefore, that motion, the Council of Code of Conduct, is now the new Councillor Code of Conduct, because according to officer's note, that particular motion was carried 9-2.
That's my numbers as well. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the biannual report of the activities of the Audit and Risk Committee, including recommendations of the Audit and Risk Committee, meeting held on the 9th of December 2020. This will be introduced by Mr Chris Hurley, Integrity Coordinator.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Councillors, as noted in the report, the Local Government Act 2020 requires Council's Audit and Risk Committee to prepare a biannual audit and risk report describing the activities of the committee and including its findings and recommendations. Council's Audit and Risk Committee was established late August 2020 and its first meeting was held 9 December. This report sets out the matters considered at that meeting together with the committee's recommendations to Council. Officers will be happy to answer any questions, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Hurley. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? There appears to be no questions, so I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I move this motion as per the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. And do I have a seconder? Councillor Watson.
Yes, I'm prepared to second the motion.
To assist Councillor Stavrou, is there any opposition? Councillor Stavrou, would you like to take to your motion?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. I will now put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item 7.3, the December 2020 quarterly performance report. This will be introduced by Mr Bruce Dobson, Director of Customer and Transformation.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Tonight the quarterly performance report details Council's financial and non-financial performance for the second quarter of the 2021 financial year. It includes performance against the operating budget, priority and capital works programs, annual commitments, strategic indicators and highlights for the quarter. There are 44 annual commitments and 48 strategic indicators which measure performance against our council plan. As of December, all of the annual commitments, work on those had commenced and 11% had been completed, and the details are in the report. 83% of the strategic indicators measured quarterly were completed or above forecast, and some have been impacted by the COVID-19 restrictions. The majority of the quarterly indicators that are there against the local government performance reporting framework are on track, again with some indicators being impacted by the COVID-19 restrictions. From a financial perspective, the overall financial position at the end of December is satisfactory. The surplus result of $101.11 million at December is due to the striking of the full-year annual rates in August, and the surplus will continue to reduce through the year as Council delivers services to the community over the remainder of the year. The favourable result at December against the year-to-date budget is due primarily to a number of timing differences for various income and expenditure items compared with the budget phasing, and details are in the report. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Mr Dobson. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? Appears to be no questions. I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to move the motion to accept the report of the officers and take the opportunity to
speak in due course. I'll just find a seconder for you, Councillor Park. Happy to second?
Yes, Mayor.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Stavrou, is there any opposition? There appears to be none. Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I would just like to thank the officers for preparing the report and the good work that goes into such a enormous amount of information that's digested for us. And also, as a new councillor, I neglected to thank the officers for the previous report, which I'd like to take the opportunity to thank them as well.
Duly noted. Thank you, Councillor Stavrou. I'm now going to put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? Declare that carried unanimously. Thank you again, councillors. And Mr Dobson. We'll move on to item 7.4, which is the Community Engagement Policy. This will be introduced by Janine Nieuwenhuizen. Thank you, Chief Customer Officer.
Hello, I'm Janine Nieuwenhuizen. It is a tough one. So good evening. The Community Engagement Policy 2021-2026 included in the report before you replaces a current Community Engagement Policy and has been developed in response to the new Local Government Act 2020. The Act requires the policies adopted by 1st of March 2021, and this evening we are bringing the policy to this council meeting for adoption. The City of Boroondara already has a well-developed policy in place that was informed by community consultation, benchmarking, and also reviewing best practice. This existing policy is the basis of the current draft of the Community Engagement Policy, which has been revised to reflect legislative requirements under the Local Government Act 2020, which included such requirements as defining deliberative engagement, statements regarding child-safe standards to ensure we provide opportunities to young people to participate and have a voice, an appropriate focus on principles and best practice for employees to follow, which will extend to the community engagement guidelines, greater clarity on the range and spectrum of community engagement practices that may be applied when engaging with the Boroondara community. Additionally, the policy has been further refined through insights gained through more recent community consultation and also following benchmarking with other local governments. The community engagement approach for the Boroondara Community Plan refresh provided an opportunity to test the application of the policy, particularly informing how to define deliberative engagement. Future applications of the policy will include consultation for key programs such as the Burundara Community Plan, Council Vision, Council Plan, the Long-Term Financial Plan and the 10-year Asset Management Plan. Officers recommend Council adopt the Community Engagement Policy tonight. It is also recommended the policy is reviewed in 12 months' time after further consultation with the community. This lapsed time will enable the community to have had exposure to the application of the policy and therefore a more informed view on how effectively it has been applied. I'm happy to take any questions that councillors may have.
Thank you. Councillors, I'm looking for any questions of officers on this policy. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you, Ms Newhison. Sorry, I can never pronounce your name. I just wanted a little bit more information on the statements of child safe practice. If you could just give a little bit more explanation of the change in that and how it impacts the ability for council officers to interact with youth.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. So the statements regarding child safe standards have been included to ensure and provide opportunities to young people to participate and have a voice. And what that essentially means is that we're looking for a representative sample. So previously it might have been difficult for various members of the community to participate, and we've adjusted the policy to ensure that they now have a voice.
Sorry if I may just ask one more follow-up. So is it no conditional of who's facilitating the conversation, guardians with children and different age groups? And so does it enable us to communicate with, for example, school groups right through to secondary students?
Yes, that's right, although it would depend on the nature of the consultation and what questions we're posing to the community. Essentially, it means that if there's a consultation that is important or affects children, then we need to find a way to try to engage with them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Councillor Biggar.
I'm not sure whether this is a question or a comment. It's probably a comment with a question at the end. Does that pass?
If there's a question there, please.
I can come up with one, yeah. First, I do really applaud this work, and I think it's very, very important. I think all of the councillors would agree that this is properly engaging with the community is really fundamental to our role as councillors. So I guess the comment, followed by the question, is coming on the heels of the deputation we had earlier tonight regarding flying the Aboriginal flags. It just highlights for me that we have not made any specific mention in our policy of how we might engage uniquely with First Nations peoples and representative bodies in Burundara. And I know some councils do have a policy that ensures that their council plans go through a process for sign-off with the relevant Aboriginal groups as part of that formal planning process. And I'm not, I realise that probably the good time to do that would be, and this is in a year maybe, when we do review that. Do you think that that could be part of our consideration of 12 months down the line, looking at how we might uniquely engage with First Nations people?
Thank you for the question. I think under 4.1 we do talk about what is community engagement, and we call out specifically various groups or individuals that may have been more difficult to reach through traditional forms of engagement. And those groups specifically around children and young people, so just following on from the earlier question, senior citizens, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and people who live with a disability and the carers. And I guess the purpose of that is to be more inclusive in our approach. I think if there's a particular group that is impacted by a consultation, then we would look to the guidelines to inform how do we reach that community group or those individuals.
Councillor Biggar, does that actually answer your question with regard to the review next year?
Well, I think it's something that to be explored more, maybe, and it is an opportunity for us to think about how consultation with First Nations groups might be similar, but also slightly different to what you suggested. But I think we have time to talk about it, so thank you. I'm happy with that answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Biggar. Any other councillors of questions of officers? There appears to be none, so I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Addis.
Yes, happy to move the officer's recommendation as a motion.
Thank you. And Councillor Biggar, are you happy to second that?
Yes, please.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Addis, is there any opposition on this item? There appears to be no opposition. Councillor Addis, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Yes, look, a thank you to the officers for this fine piece of work, and I commend you on making it relatively tight. It's a well-written, not too lengthy document. I think in many ways it reflects, formalises what we are already doing, and I particularly like the emphasis on including young people when we can. I know we do that, but I think it's something to call out and acknowledge, and also perhaps a clearer definition of the deliberative engagement, which again, I think in a large measure we have been doing for some time, but it's good to see that acknowledged in a formal way. And I certainly acknowledge Councillor Biggar's suggestion, I suppose, that when we review this, we look at perhaps other groups that we might want to specifically mention, although I'm sure as best we can we already include them, but wouldn't hurt to call them out. So I certainly commend the report, and as a consequence, this motion to my fellow councillors. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. I'll now put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? Declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item 7.5, the contract 2020/25/3, Rathmines Reserve Pavilion alterations and additions. This will be introduced by Ms Christine White, Manager of Capital Projects, in due course.
Thank you. Through you, Mr Mayor. The Rathmines Reserve Pavilion is funded for redevelopment through Council's budget and includes 2 federal grants to the total value of $280,000 that contributes to this project. Rathmines Reserve is home to a very active men's and women's sports club with a large membership base. There's been rapid growth of women's football, junior competitions, and changes in the operation and expectation of sporting clubs. Pavilions such as Rathmines Reserve no longer provide the required standard of accommodation to support community sporting activities. Rathmines Reserve Pavilion is an existing 2-storey building. The proposed works retain the existing 2-storey shell with extensions involving extensive internal alterations and additions to provide much needed and improved facilities. The facility, when completed, will include 4 change rooms and amenities, a dual umpire room, first aid room required for AFL club standards, an enlarged social room with store to accommodate existing user numbers, public toilet facilities, and improved functionality to the kiosk and kitchen. The existing ground floor storage is also retained. The project will require the provisions of temporary facilities for the clubs during the construction period, and these facilities will be accommodated in the adjacent William Angliss Oval and removed at completion of works. Extensive consultation was undertaken with the Sports Club, Melbourne Water, adjacent impacted residents, and also broader consultation with a letter drop to over 400 residents, and no objections were received to the works. The existing building consists of 315 square metres of building, and this footprint remains in place, with a proposed 40 square addition to the south end of the building and an additional 4 square metres to the east end of the building at the ground floor level. This ground floor extension, in addition to the first floor, will increase the floor space by approximately 130 square metres, or about 41% increase to floor space. The development has been guided by Council's policy for the development and funding of community pavilions 2019, and also addresses the site constraints to protect trees and also requirements by Melbourne Water's drain. The pavilion is subject to a heritage overlay, and the planning application required the north elevation on the oval side to retain its original character. Council's Heritage Advisor deemed that the additions and the alterations as sympathetic to the heritage precinct, with building materials consisting of brick, timber and metal window frames. This report seeks to award a contract for the required refurbishment and extension to the existing Rathmines Pavilion for a lump sum of $1,434,518,000, excluding GST. Council invited tenders from suitably qualified organisations from the Victorian State Government Construction Supply Register, and 4 companies submitted tenders. The tender evaluation panel assessed all tenders and received against both quantitative and qualitative criteria, and satisfied that the recommendation to award it to Bowden Corporation can perform the required works and demonstrate best value for money. Pending award of contract, works are anticipated to commence in March, April and be completed early 2022. In summary, the officer's recommendation is to award the contract as per the council report, authorise the Director of Places and Spaces to execute the contract agreement, and note that the expenditure under this contract is in accordance with Council's adopted 2021 budget and the foreshadowed 21-22 budget. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. And just to assist councillors and also our gallery and those watching online, there's a little administrative correction that it is the, rather than the Services Special Committee, it's actually the Council will resolve the following. So just if we can take that on note. I'll hand to questions of councillors. I believe there are no questions of councillors. Councillor Franco.
Thank you. I wonder if you could expand just on section 9 of the reports, section 8 of the report, social and environmental issues. You do touch, the report does touch upon the social impact, but there's no reference to the environmental aspects of the design of the construction. I wonder if you wouldn't mind touching on that.
Thank you, Councillor. Through you, Mr Mayor. The environmental aspects are guided by the Sustainable Buildings Policy 2016 that ensures that our revitalised buildings are in line with sustainable principles to provide high quality spaces for community. This particular building does meet a 5-star rating in accordance with the Green Building Council of Australia design.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you. I'd like to move the officer's recommendation subject to the opening statement change that you mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. There are no further questions, so I'm in search of a seconder for Councillor Sinfield. Councillor Gillies.
I'm very happy to second that. Thank you, Mayor.
Fantastic. To assist Councillor Sinfield, is there any opposition on this item? Yep, the floor, Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Mayor. Very briefly, the upcoming renovations at Rathmines Reserve are well overdue. The accommodation there offered to our 4 tenant sporting clubs and community groups is very much in need of this upgrade, and I thank the officers for the work that they've done on bringing this to us tonight. I'm excited by the project, which is a very modest modernisation and a balanced upgrade which respects the East Hawthorn area and surrounds, and I commend this contract to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. I'll now put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item 7.6, which is the intention to lease City Power Substation. Just pause for a moment. This will be introduced by Ms Callista Clark, Acting Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through you, Mr Mayor. This report is for Council to consider and endorse the recommendation outlined in this report to enter a lease with City Power to install an electricity substation at the Kew Recreation Centre. As part of the redevelopment of the Kew Recreation Centre, a new electricity substation is required to meet the power demands of the new centre. The substation is proposed to be located in the north-east corner of the site, adjacent to property 21 Disraeli Street, Kew. The resident of this property has been consulted and has requested appropriate noise barriers to be installed. Council officers will ensure that this occurs as part of the installation of the substation. The proposed lease term with City Power is 30 years, with a further option of 20 years. Under Section 190 of the Local Government Act 1989, where any lease has a term of 10 years or more, Council must give public notice and consider any submissions received in accordance with Section 223 of the Local Government Act. Public notice was given in The Age on Thursday, 17th December 2020, and also on Council's website. The closing date for submissions was Friday, 15th January 2021. There were no submissions received during the public notice period. Officers are happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Ms Clark. Councillor, is there any questions of the officers on this item? Councillor Galt.
I'd just like to ask about the lease term. Did you say it was a period of time followed by a further period of time thereafter?
Sorry, I wasn't sure if I won. Yes, the lease term with City Power is 30 years with an option to extend to 20, a further 20.
Given the immense changes potential in the power industry coming up over the next decade or so, might there have been advantages in having a shorter lease period? Because the dominance of certain companies may not be the same over that period.
I understand that it is for 30 years, but I'm happy to take that on notice and get back. Sorry, thank you, Councillor Gold. Yes, there is an option to remove that 20-year period, and we can do that.
I guess the obvious answer is any disadvantage at this time of doing that, but it doesn't affect the lease that you're going to get for the space.
Correct.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Mayor. Just for community confidence, and I suppose that of the councillors around the table as well, is there any conflict with this item and the Kew Rec project?
So what's your question specifically again when you say conflict?
In relation to the siting of this substation, I just want to be sure that there's no conflict with the Kew Rec site.
With the proposed development
and
of...
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
The CEO will answer that.
Thank you.
I actually asked that question myself and was assured that the location has been part of the design process and is therefore incorporated.
You got a follow-up, Councillor Sinfield?
I do, thank you. Should it not be included in the design, would we end up with a better design outcome for the Kew Rec if this didn't feature within the site?
Through the CEO?
I might actually request some assistance with regard to what the alternative use of that space would be. What I can say to you is that if the substation is not included on the site, there will be no Kew Recreation Centre. Just to put it in perspective, I think it's important. I might just seek some guidance as to whether or not there's anything through the design process whereby the land taken up by this proposal would otherwise have been put to better use. Perhaps, Carolyn, I might ask, do you have any insight into that through the process?
I understand that it isn't actually jeopardising anything to do with the KRC design.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you.
Councillor Stavrey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't have any questions, but I'd like to foreshadow a motion.
Duly noted. Any other questions from councillors? Councillor Park.
Thank you. Just following on from the question from Councillor Galt, could we just hear the rationale for the choice, firstly, of the initial term of 30 years and secondly, for the proposal to make a further option of 20 years available?
I'll answer it.
The CEO will answer.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess with these substations, they are viewed as long-term installations for two reasons. One, because in this case the asset itself is going to generate an additional demand for power, which the network is not currently capable of servicing. There is a current substation in Disraeli Street which is not going to be adequate to accommodate the demands. The second thing is that as the population density continues to grow, so too does the demand. And therefore the likelihood that the demand is going to drop off is very, very low. So in many respects, when you see these utilities go in, it's highly unlikely they'll ever be removed. And indeed, what's more likely to happen across the network in a municipality going through additional growth is you'll be seeing more and more of these. And we actually quite commonly see substation requests from the utilities whenever we do larger scale projects because they can see a deficiency in their network.
Councillor Park.
Just precisely though in terms of the period, the 30 years, so I understand the permanence, but I guess the motivation for the question is in part the quantum of the lease, which is I think is 10 cents a year or something, and clearly that's imposed upon us. But circumstances might change in the future. They might well not, but they might change in the future whereby we could get a proper return, if you like, for a space like that. And obviously if we're in a lease that provides for an initial 30-year term, then we're stuck with that for a period. And we've obviously council in other areas has been the, I'll say, beneficiary of very generous lease terms executed decades and decades ago. So are we in the position where a minimum term of 30 years is also imposed upon us, or are we at liberty to make it something shorter if we saw fit, and if so, what?
Oh, great. Thanks for the clarification. I might just seek some guidance as to whether there is any flexibility with regard to the term.
20 years is a requirement for the city council.
Okay, 20. So the minimum City Power will allow is 20 years.
30 years.
30 years.
30 years plus the option for 20. That's City Power's requirements to install the substation.
Okay. So the advice is that City Power has put this to us as their minimum requirement, 30 plus 20.
Councillor Park, that answered your question. Thank you. Councillor Biggar.
Sorry, that answered my question. But though, while I have the mic, can I just ask a minor point that might show my ignorance, and that is just the fact that it could have been because the timing didn't give us any other choice, but I'm always a little bit antsy about public notices going up just before Christmas and then closing mid-January. Is that a practice that we would normally undertake, or is it?
Through the CEO.
Thank you. We generally try to avoid seeking community engagement during the Christmas period. So we generally take specific steps to avoid that. It seems in this case there has been a deliberate consultation with the immediately impacted neighbour, and that process has resulted in what we were previously being advised earlier about the need for a sound wall to protect the site. So I think that is probably what has led to this particular outcome. But it is our standard practice, for example, with planning applications, which would be advertised to the community to actually stop that process either during December or indeed to extend it for a much longer period of time to allow for the return from holidays so the community can contribute. So we're cognizant of the concern that sits behind your question.
Thank you very much. That's good to hear.
Thanks, Councillor Biggar. Councillor Radis.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor. If we accept that it's essentially 30 plus 20, during that lease period, if we chose to not use the power for all sorts of reasons, is that okay, or do we have an obligation to source our power for the QREC from City Power through this station?
At the present time, the power supplier for that area is City Power. However, Council can and indeed has agreed to source its power through a green energy provider. And we can continue to do that. That may not be City Power. They're providing a substation to ensure the overall load for the area is able to be accommodated. But that doesn't oblige Council to remain with City Power so long as there is another provider in the marketplace who can provide power to us. So there's a bit of a difference between the retail and the distribution network.
Thank you. I think that's clarified it. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Addis. Councillor Galt.
Thank you. My question is very much like Councillor Addis's question about locking into a particular provider. It also, I presume that this substation doesn't just provide power or service the QREC centre. It's actually a zonal substation which would provide houses right around it.
Thank you, through you, Mr Mayor. We'll have to take that on notice, but it is to provide power as a result of the Kew Recreation Centre. So the demand in use there is required a new substation.
Okay, and so the supplementary question to that is, whilst we may have come to an arrangement with City Power that in fact we can get power from green sources, does it lock in houses right around the area to using City Power? They are the provider at the moment, but I could anticipate a time when there'd be much more competition in the marketplace.
Thank you, through you, Mr Mayor. I'd have to take that on notice.
Sorry, Ms Clark. Ms White may be able to assist in responding.
Through you, Mr Mayor, the current upgrade is only to service Kew Recreation Centre. That's the trigger for the upgrade.
Thank you, Ms White. I think that answers the two questions, Councillor Galt. There appears to be no further questions, so I'll move back to Councillor Stavrou. You foreshadowed a motion.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to move the motion to accept the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrou. And Councillor Watson, happy to second that motion?
Happy to second, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Stavrou, is there any opposition on this motion? There appears to be none. Councillor Stavrou, do you want to speak to your motion?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor. Apart from thanking the officers for the hard work, particularly for this particular work, and also the broader work for the Kew Recreation Centre, which is a very big project, as we know, in my ward.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrou. I'll now put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? Declare that carried unanimously. Thank you again, councillors. For our gallery, I recognise there are a number of participants from the earlier presentation from the Burundara Reconciliation Network. You're more than welcome to remain and listen to council deliberation, but you're also more than welcome to leave if that time is appropriate. Move on to item 7.7, which is 1 Cherry Road, Balwyn, proposed discontinuance of road, the right of road. This will be introduced again by Ms Clark, Acting Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you. And through you, Mr Mayor, this report is to seek council resolution to commence the statutory process to discontinue a small section of road adjoining the owned property located at 1 Cherry Road, Balwyn. The property is the former maternal and child health centre. Officers became aware of a small encroachment by the building footprint of the property into the adjoining road reserve, and as an outcome of a re-establishment survey undertaken. As a result, the proposal is to discontinue 1.1 metres of the adjoining 1 Cherry Road, Balwyn, as shown hatched in attachment 1. The section of road forms a small part of the nature strip. Therefore, there will be no impact in relation to the traffic flow or the safety of pedestrians accessing the constructed section of the road and adjoining nature strip. Relevant service authorities and council departments have been consulted as outlined in the report, and no objections have been received. The statutory process requires council to give public notice of its intention to discontinue the small section of road. All abutting property owners will be advised of the proposal in writing, detailing their rights to making a submission. If any submissions are received, a further report will be presented to council to consider the submissions. Once discontinued, the land from the road is proposed to be transferred to council. Happy to take any questions. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Ms Clark. Councillors, any questions of officers? Councillor Gold.
Could I just seek clarification on the current legal ownership of that lane?
Through the CEO.
Yes, I might just make the observation that while this has been confirmed, many of the lanes throughout the city are still in the name of the original subdivider and remain as such. The legislation in the Local Government Act is specifically designed to recognise that and the fact that you won't be able to track down that original subdivider, and therefore enables council to formally go through a process like this one, where you seek to discontinue the road and to vest the land in yourself. Council has the ability in doing so to either retain ownership of the land or indeed to sell the land on to the abutting owners who may have an interest. And council does have an ongoing program to do exactly that. There are many members of our community who come to us on the basis they either wish to close discontinued roads, close roads, or alternatively have already taken the land into their property without the appropriate consent, and we then need to go through these sorts of processes. Is it in the name of the original subdivider? It is in the name of the original subdivider.
Thank you, Councillor Gold. Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Mr Mayor. Can I just clarify that that would mean that this land could have it could be fenced then by the current owner or a subsequent owner? I mean, I'm assuming that's to the roadway?
This land is council's.
Yes.
The situation you have is that the current council building overhangs the land. We're seeking to take the land into the council title to effectively legitimise something which happened quite some time ago, and to make sense of it, so that if council wishes to dispose of the land, the structure is entirely within council's title.
Thank you. I have a motion when the time is right.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. There appears to be no questions, so Councillor Addis, you may wish to move your motion.
As printed on the screen. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. And to assist Councillor Addis, I've got Councillor Sinfield. You happy?
Happy to second.
Second that. Is there any opposition on that item? There appears to be none. Councillor Addis, do you wish to speak to it?
Thanks very much. I did go down and have a look, and I think what's being said makes absolute sense. It is a matter of tidying up a slightly unusual situation. And my understanding is that what I saw was that it won't in any way affect the workings in the area. And I think it's worth noting that this is very much the start of a process, that we're just actually putting it out there to hear from our community, and should there be concerns, we will have the opportunity to listen to them and address them in the way that seems appropriate. So I certainly support the recommendation up on the screen.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. I now put that vote to the put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? Declare that carried unanimously. Thank you again, councillors. Call on to item 7.8, which is the contract number 2019-153, the Hawthorn Rowing Club construction of a new rowing ramp contract variation authorisation. This will be introduced again by Ms White, Manager of Capital Projects.
Thank you. Through you, Mr Mayor. The Hawthorn Rowing Ramp is one of the most popular ramps along the Yarra and is used by the public, local schools and the Hawthorn Rowing Club. The Hawthorn Rowing Club, Xavier and Genazzano College lease pavilions from council and access the river via the current wooden ramp that is in poor condition, and replacement is needed to enhance safe access for recreation. Council has been working for some time with Melbourne Water as the approving water authority to guide the design. Melbourne Water has had a number of very strict conditions that Council has been working to meet. This has required a number of additional hydraulic studies that has resulted in design changes that ultimately has increased the construction cost. Whilst the budget was approved for this variation in the September amended budget, this report seeks Council's approval for variation to meet procurement policy. In addition, the rowing stakeholders have contributed $375,000 towards this project, and council officers have written to Melbourne Water seeking any grant opportunities to meet Melbourne Water's conditions that may contribute to this variation, and officers are still awaiting a response for opportunities to contribute to this through grant opportunities. I'm happy to take any questions on this particular project.
Thank you. Councillor Gold.
I'd like to start by foreshadowing a motion on this.
Duly noted, Councillor Gold.
Thank you, but I was going to ask a question about the cost, the $400,000, but I think you've answered that it was included in the budget, and what we're looking at is now the total cost. Thank you.
Are there any other questions of councillors to officers? There appears to be none. Councillor Gold.
I'd like to move that this variation, as moved by the officers, is accepted.
Thank you, Councillor Gold. And a second, Councillor Sinfield.
Happy to second.
Very good. To assist Councillor Gold, is there any opposition on this item? I'll hand to you, Councillor Gold, to speak to your motion.
I guess I can only just say that we're very fortunate to have such a wonderful river to row on, albeit small and a bit brown coloured. I understand the current boat ramp is quite dangerous, and I understand that sport is very popular in the area, and what's being proposed by Melbourne Water is a much more up-to-date standard that is quite common. So I can only but support what's being proposed.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. I'll now put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you again, councillors. Move on to item 7.9, contract number 2020-335, Alamein Neighbourhood and Learning Centre renewal, upgrade and extension works. This will be again introduced by Ms White, Manager of Capital Projects.
Thank you. Through you, Mr Mayor. Council is refurbishing an existing building at Alamein Neighbourhood and Learning Centre building at 49 Ashburton Grove in Ashburton, that's opposite Alamein Station, to improve and support a range of learning and community services. Consultation with centre users took place in 2019 to inform the design. A concept plan developed that responded to the feedback, and tenants have temporary accommodation at 1 Samarinda Avenue, Ashburton, during the construction period. Key features of the upgrade include a new reception space that is welcoming, new office accommodation with meeting room, a new kitchen and common area with an adjoining deck outside, additional classroom space for craft workshop and a computer room, remote learning opportunities within classrooms, and bicycle parking and off-street car parking, including a loading zone and accessible car park on the eastern side of a new car park and a new car park to the western side. This report seeks to award a contract for the works under contract 2020-335, renewal, upgrade and extension for a total cost of $1,411.90.85, excluding GST, which is in accordance with Council's adopted budget for 2021 and foreshadowed budget in 21-22. Council invited tenders from suitably qualified organisation for the Victorian State Government Construction Supplier Register, which is in accordance with requirements under Section 186 of the Local Government Act, and 4 submissions were received. The tender evaluation panel assessed all tenders against both quantitative and qualitative criteria and satisfied that the recommended contractor, Alchemy Construct, can perform the required works and demonstrated best value for money when assessed against weighted matrix and selection criteria. Pending award of contract, works are anticipated to commence in March, April and be completed late 21. In summary, the officer's recommendation is to award the contract as per the council report, authorise the Director of Places and Spaces to execute the contract agreement, and note that expenditure under this contract is in accordance with council's adopted 2020-21 budget and the 21-22 foreshadowed budget. Happy to take any questions on this project.
Thank you. And to councillors, are there any questions of officers? Councillor Watson.
No questions, Mr Mayor, but happy to foreshadow a motion at the appropriate time, noting that this particular development's in your ward.
Thank you, councillor. Any other questions of officers? There appears to be none. Councillor Watson, your motion?
Yes, as printed on the screen. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. And do I have a seconder? I have Councillor Hollingsworth. Thank you. To assist Councillor Watson, is there any opposition on this item? There appears to be none. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm delighted to be able to move this motion, and as someone who has attended functions from time to time down in the Solway ward, I can confirm that they are a highly engaged bunch of people, and this particular upgrade will be very, very well used and very much appreciated.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I'll now put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you again, councillors. We'll move on to item 7.10, which is the adoption of the terms of reference for advisory groups. This will be introduced by Mr David Shepherd, Manager of Environmental Sustainability and Open Space.
Thank you, and through you, Mr Mayor. This report presents the terms of reference for 5 new advisory committees for Council's consideration. The committees are the Climate Action Plan Advisory Committee, the Cycling Advisory Committee, Gardners Creek Master Plan Advisory Committee, Glenferrie Precinct Development Plan Advisory Committee, and the City of Boroondara Heritage Advisory Committee. All of these committees were established as internal advisory groups with membership made up of council officers and the councillors who were appointed at the special council meeting on 30th of November. The terms of references set out the purpose of each committee consistent with council's formal decision-making process, considering community feedback and the Burundara Community Plan. They're not decision-making bodies, but are intended to inform council's decision-making. The terms of reference should be adopted by council to enable these committees to begin their meeting cycles and delivering positive outcomes for the organisation and for the community. The officer's recommendation is on the screen now, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr Shepherd. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? There appears to be no questions. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Franco.
I'm happy to move the motion, but I'd like to foreshadow an amendment and whether to do that. Sorry?
Yep, so, yeah, I think you've got some words.
I have some words.
And we might... No. So
well, I know, but I'm happy to move it with an amendment or...
So Councillor Franco, you've got... this is Councillor Franco's motion on the screen. Councillor Franco, up on the screen, I believe is the motion that you have.
Correct, thank you.
Thank you. And to assist Councillor Franco, is there a seconder to this motion? Ooh. Councillor...
He can have it.
Hands and lights. And the Councillor Galt, I believe you're seconding this motion.
Thank you.
Thank you. So to assist councillors, is there any opposition on the attached? There is one, maybe two. So I'll hand to you, Councillor Franco, to speak to your motion.
Thank you. I think the advisory groups that have been established at the first ordinary meeting of this council are very significant, and they reflect the values and collective values of the new council as a whole, and they cover a range of issues which reflect our collective priorities. I won't speak at length to them because I expect other councillors will probably wish to speak to individual or collectively to the committees in question. I'll just go to the heart of the amendment that I've suggested to the officer's motion that is being incorporated into the motion that I'm moving. The background to this is that I've long advocated for the benefit of including and seeking to incorporate community professional expertise that exists in our community into our advisory committees, and I mean that generally. I've specifically repeatedly spoken about the Climate Advisory Committee, but I think it's applicable to all committees, and it doesn't have to happen immediately, etc., and there's different ways of achieving that. But I certainly think there is professional expertise out there that we can harness, and that people are keen to volunteer often that professional expertise. We do harness such expertise in some ways in the community in respect of our Customer First Committee. We've publicly advertised a position and appointed somebody who brings professional background and input that really adds to the deliberations and capability of the committee in question. And similarly, in an analogous way, our Audit Committee has external representatives who bring professional expertise. I think there's always a benefit in harnessing such expertise. Having had, though, the benefit of discussions with many of my colleagues and looking at the best way to harness external input, I mean, and acknowledging that there are a variety of views. I mean, some councillors who will potentially oppose bringing in external experts, but there are different ways of bringing in expertise, whether it's at the level of the board or at the advisory committee with people brought on, or as and when required to bring in professional expertise. And I just want to clarify that in relation to bringing in professional expertise, I'm not referring in the case of the Climate Committee that we bring on or have a debate about climate science or pro or anti climate issues. I'm specifically referring to professional corporate expertise in addressing emissions, corporate emissions, people with professional backgrounds that can assist in our deliberations. But looking forward and recognising the diversity and complexity of local government and the nature of the operations and the way we can get people in, and various colleagues have commented to me about, well, if we got one person on a committee, they might have a narrow band of expertise, or they might have a particular viewpoint. They might be able to assist with one area of our operations. It is probably better to bring in experts as and when required. And look, so I've tried to come up with a motion that addresses those issues and that harnesses that professional expertise as and when required. And I really think that's the heart of it. It's really drawing in expertise that we require when we require. And I hope that is satisfactory to my colleagues.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Any other councillor seeking to speak on this item? Councillor Addis.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I think I'm struggling to decide which way to fall on this, because when I read the words that were put before us within the documentation, they essentially say the same thing. And to me, they encompass what we needed to do. I don't know, I'd like to hear from other people, I think, because I'm struggling to get a sense of whether this is just blowing it up to more than it needs to be and carries implications that perhaps weren't intended. So I'd be very interested to hear other people's views before I vote.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. I have Councillor Watson up next.
Thank you. Yes, I'm opposed to this motion. The first 3 lines are essentially what we do anyway. I mean, these are advisory groups, and these groups do seek technical and other advice from internal departments and external organisations so that they can provide the advice to council that they're charged to do. I have serious issues with the next 2 lines, which talk about individuals from external organisations being co-opted onto the group. I mean, that would require a whole nother level of governance if you were going to go down that road. And also individuals from external organisations on groups, that comes with dollars attached. And I have concerns about whether you're just writing an open cheque for these advisory groups to co-opt a person here and a person there. I'm very opposed to that particular model going into our advisory groups, and just want to have it noted that I've participated and continue to participate on many advisory groups and have never, ever seen the need to go down that particular road. Yes, I do note that BC1, we chose to do something a little bit different, and that at the time was debated and talked about at the last council a great deal, and that's where we landed. But never did we just give an open invitation to advisory groups to start co-opting people as they please. So I do not support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm in a similar situation to Councillor Watson, and I would have supported the officer's recommendation that appeared on the screen before us prior to this motion being put. I intend to oppose this motion because of the following. The word co-opted indicates to me some sense of permanency where an individual from an external organisation or otherwise may be co-opted onto the group, and that would go against the Terms of Reference Part 5 on page 10 and page 11 of the Terms of Reference put to us this evening, where the membership is largely articulated there. The cost is unknown, unlimited and unbudgeted for, and that causes me concern should the expertise come at an expense to Council. The first three lines, as I said, are substantively alike to that already prescribed, and I am not comfortable with policy on the fly, which this is this evening. So I will oppose this motion, but should this fail and the officer's original recommendation appear before us, I will happily support it.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Councillor Galt.
I'm very pleased to see the support for the first part of the paragraph, because I think once we get a climate action plan in place, there's a lot of work to be done. And I've seen other councils struggle with the details. Now, we've got some wonderful officers on board, but it requires them to have very in-depth knowledge across a wide range of topics. But I do recognise that most of that and the assistance they may need is covered in the first half of that paragraph. But there may be times when some person or a particular expert needs to join us for a period of time. But I'm happy to support the addition of that second sentence, because I can't anticipate that proceeding without coming back and seeking funds to do so. I don't see it as an open cheque at all. It's just saying that it's foreshadowing that from time to time we may need some serious help if we want to draft some really good policy initiatives, and someone might have to join us for a week or two or a month or 2 or 3 meetings. And I would anticipate, because we won't have the money to do it when we choose to, that would come back and get approval or be rejected.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. My first two queries have actually been aired already, so I won't reiterate what's already been spoken to. I can't speak for the other committees, but with the Heritage Advisory Committee, which all 4 councillors on that, we're very clear about having this wording similarly and certainly with the same intent in the body of our terms of reference. I'm not seeing any need to add it, which is really just repeating it. And to be quite honest, it's only when people go to look at the terms of reference that they will see that material. This material, I think, will actually get lost in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. Councillor Park.
Thank you, Chair. I move an amendment to paragraph 1 by deleting what's there and replacing it with paragraph 1 from the officer's recommendation. The effect of that amendment would be to substitute the officer's recommendation for this motion.
Thank you. So the amendment that we have in front of us is the officer's recommendation, which is your motion, Councillor Park. So to assist Councillor Park, is there a seconder to Councillor Park? Councillor Watson?
Happy to second.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Park, is there any opposition to what is referenced on the screen as Councillor Park's amendment? Councillor Bigger? Yep. Councillor Park.
Thank you. Look, I'll be very brief, because I don't think this needs to be the subject of enormous debate. What's important here is that most, if not all, councillors agree on the approach, which is largely that's reflected in the officer's recommendation and the motion that's now before you. The essential difference was the ability of the Climate Action Plan Advisory Committee or group, I'm not sure why there's a distinction there, but for that committee to most unusually have the ability to co-opt additional members. That has never been a feature of Council's advisory committees and shouldn't be. It simply shouldn't be. Council, not a committee, should be the determinant of the members of its own advisory committees. In all other respects, these motions are identical. In my view, that's the appropriate way forward. As to the suggestion that, oh, well, if this were to happen, it would surely come back. Well, no, that's not what the motion previously moved actually indicated. The committee of its own motion could co-opt members, and suddenly we'd have additional members who hadn't been appointed by council. And we've never done that, and I see no good reason to do that. Council tonight is determining who it is who will sit on these committees. That's the appropriate way to proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Are there any other councillors seeking to speak on this amendment? Councillor, no? Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I support Councillor Park's comments, and I don't want to deflect from what an amazing achievement we're looking at here this evening to implement 5 amazing advisory committees, and certainly with the Heritage Advisory Committee and Inaugural Committee. The others are perhaps configurations of prior committees, but Heritage Advisory, this is the inaugural committee, and it's a very exciting time. And I concur that due diligence has been done over several weeks, if not months, of putting together the terms of reference in consultation with assigned appointed committee members and council representatives. And I look forward to when the committees can form. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. There appear to be no further speakers. Councillor Franco.
Thanks. I'd just like to respond to some of the issues that have been raised, and I'll just touch them on in turn. Firstly, I mean, the assumption that we should go with the officer's recommendation and not include the variation that I proposed was referenced firstly because we're doing it anyway, and so there's no need. If that argument was put forward, if that's the case, then there's absolutely no harm with the amendment. So if it's intended, if it's incorporated, then what's the concern about it? Secondly, the issue of the budget, very important issue. Certainly, it's a topic that's very close to my heart, and being financially responsible. Advisory committees don't have authority to spend money, so including a reference like that does not in any way open up any chequebook nor give any authority to any advisory committee to spend any funds. There are, however, operational funds to put together the various works and to underpin the work of each of those committees, and that exists. And those funds are managed by council officers in the appropriate manner. So to suggest that any of the work of any of these committees is somehow unfunded, you know, branching out into areas that we need to come back for more funds. If we need to come back for more funds because the work of the committee is unfunded, that's a separate matter, not in relation to who sits on that committee. And to the extent that any committee engages external consultants to underpin that, that's a professional matter that as well would require advice from officers in relation to. Another point that's been made has been that it's an open invitation to just anybody to come in whenever they want. It's certainly not the case, and that's not the intention, and I just don't think that to suggest that is misleading. That's not at the heart of it at all. Then the final point, that we've never seen the need, well, 2 points here. We've never seen the need to harness external expertise on any of our advisory committees. Well, if that's the case, I think that suggests that we should be actually looking at our past practices and seeing, not just here, but asking ourselves, why has the past practice, if it's true, of Boroondara Council to never harness expertise? I mean, that's a striking fact. I wonder whether that's accurate. And the final point, that we've never done it before, well, I simply point to the Customer First Advisory Committee if we've never done it before, we have done it there and we've done it fairly recently. Look, I'll leave it at that. I think it's important to harness expertise. If my motion fails, I'll still support the other one. Thank you.
Before I hand back to the mover, just a point of clarification as raised. I'll hand to the CEO.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just to confirm, so there is no confusion, reference was made earlier to, well, we're already doing this. That's not the case in the context of arranging for the co-opting of people onto these committees. We actually haven't been doing that, and we don't do that. The way it works at the present time is that if a committee wished to hear from an external party as a presenter, then that would be open to them. It's not open to a committee to co-opt another person onto it as a member of that committee. I just want to be clear about that because there's been some confusion in the language. But what is being proposed here, the second part particularly, is not and has not been our practice. Just want to be clear about that. The second point, again, just for clarification in relation to the Boorandarra Customer First appointment of the independent advisor, that person has been appointed to be exactly that, to provide independent oversight of the program in supporting the committee in undertaking their tasks. So again, it's a very different role to the one being contemplated here, which is not so much one of oversight, but one of active engagement and involvement with the committee's deliberations. So I just wanted to draw attention to distinctions between some of the things which are being said in the context of this discussion.
Thank you, Mr Storer. I'm going to return back to debate, and I recognise, before I turn to you, Councillor Park, Councillor Stavrou has put his light on. Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you for the words of Mr Storer. I guess initially, with the words that were put up in lieu of the officer's words, I was inclined to think that there was no harm done. We're doing that anyway. Mr Storer has clarified that, but in the debate, I was also feeling the same kind of, I guess, discomfort that when we're talking about bringing into a committee somebody with specific skills for a specific task to help us over is different than co-opting somebody. I think if we would bring somebody external to a committee, that should be part of our prior policy, that we need somebody for that committee. They would be interviewed for that committee for a broad range of skills. I don't think in this committee we're talking about that. There is no, to my knowledge, specific skill set that has climate change in mind. There are skill sets, but no specific skills. And I think to make that change, innocuous that it appeared, would completely change the flavour of our terms. That's what I would say, and I will not be able to support that for that reason.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrou. There are no other speakers on this. I'll return to the mover, Councillor Park.
Thank you. Well, firstly, I adopt and endorse the remarks by Councillor Stavrou. That is exactly my position. Uncannily, in response to Councillor Franco, I'd made two notes and Mr Storer covered them both. And I'm grateful that we record these proceedings because the word misleading was used, and to the extent that it might have been thought that something that I said was misleading, you might care to listen to what I actually said, because second time around you'll hear that I certainly didn't say that Council has never sought external expertise. That's simply nonsense, and I didn't say that. I didn't hear any other councillor say that either. And one only needs to look at the Safety Advisory Committee, which is full of experts from other places. And you've heard me speak about that committee only recently. So I absolutely acknowledge what the CEO had to say, and that's that really is the position. And on that basis, I'd urge all councillors to support the motion or the amended motion. Thank you.
So I'm now putting to councillors to vote on the amendment. All those in favour? Those against? Declare the amendment carried. The amendment is now the substantive motion with the mover of Councillor Park and Councillor Watson. I'll now move to vote on this. So all those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item 8, general business. Councillors, are there any items of general business this evening? Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would like to say a few words about a particular grant of ours and some gratitude that we received, and I think that there are some things about that would be good for the community to know as well, if I may. Please. So, over the weekend, I had the pleasure to attend a play called Blood and Bones at the Renaissance Theatre in Kew. And the play was an epic story of mateship and courage that Meg McKenna wrote to honour World War II veterans Ned O'Leary, Jack Gallagher and Alan Simpson, who enlisted in Hawthorn, and they were of the 27th Australian Infantry Battalion, and asked to tell their story with gratitude for the brave people of Crete that it shows also how nations can forge undying friendships in times of crisis. Just a brief context to the play. When the Costa Rica was sunk on the 27th of April in 1941, Ned and his mates landed on Crete with scarce supplies and sheltered under olive trees. Villagers brought them food. In May 1941, when the first ever paratroopers invasion occurred in the Battle of Crete, locals fought beside the Anzacs, taking reprisals, death to hide them and tend their wounds and help them escape. Like Ned, Jack and Alan, 3,106 Australians and 2,180 New Zealanders were taken prisoners of war there. Too few people know the story of pain that they suffered, and also how villagers, including women and children, risked their lives for Australian strangers. The play is very timely, as 2021 is the 80th anniversary of World War II's Greek campaign for the Australian Army, and it's also the 200th anniversary of Greek independence. Lest we forget their sacrifices, and as a Greek Australian, with my grandfather having fought in the Italian campaign of the same war, I have a family connection to this. But as a councillor, I'm proud that Boroondara's World War II commemorative grant made this play possible, and commend the previous council's decision to convey the gratitude of the author and the director.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrou. Duly noted, and wholeheartedly support your words. Councillors, any other further items of general business? Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just briefly, I just wanted to acknowledge that today is significant with the release and rollout of the COVID vaccine. When we reflect on 12 months ago, the vaccine was just a vision and a hope, and almost 12 months to the day, the vaccine was produced, trialled and tested, and here we are on the 22nd of February 2021 with the rollout of the vaccine helping to protect the Australian community. So I think it's quite a significant day.
Duly noted. Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. There appears to be no further items of general business. Are there any items of urgent business? There appear to be none. We will move into item 10, which is confidential business, and we need to close the meeting, which is the appointment of the Audit and Risk Committee. We'll need to close the meeting to public. Councillors, I'm in search of a colleague moving the following motion, which I'll just read out. The motion is one that, in accordance with section 66(1) and 66(2)(a) of the Local Government Act 2020, the meeting is closed to members of the public for the consideration of the agenda item titled Appointment to the Audit and Risk Committee. And 2, this agenda item is confidential information for the purposes of section 3(1) of the Local Government Act 2020. A, because it contains personal information, being information which is released, which if released would result in unreasonable disclosure of information about any person or their personal affairs, section 3(1)(f) and B. This ground applies because the agenda item concerns a personal and contractual matter, and the premature disclosure of personal information would be prejudicial to the interests of the other person and council. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Park.
So moved.
Thank you. And Councillor Sinfield.
Happy to second.
Thank you. I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favours? I declare that carried. So I declare the council meeting is now closed to the public. To the Thank you. We'll need to reopen the meeting to public. Could I please have a motion to reopen the council meeting to the public? Councillor Park.
So moved.
And seconded Councillor Watson. I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. To members of the community watching tonight's proceedings, welcome back to live streaming of the council meeting. You've actually joined us at the end of council business for this evening. So before I close the meeting, I wish to thank you all who've joined us for this evening. I wish you and your family good health. Please stay safe. I declare the council meeting closed at 9:20. Goodbye for now. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Oh.